Hey everyone, thanks for joining on time. We will just give this a minute or so before we get started and we start nerding out a little bit about third-party risk management. I know James, you're super excited to show off some of the risk module, show off some workflows because I know you love workflows. So yeah, it should be
Who
good.
doesn't?
And yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we'll just give it like a minute or so, just let anyone come in and
Mhm.
yeah, then we'll make a start.
Yeah. I guess it's worth the preface up front as well for those people who are attending. This is going to be recorded and shared after the call's done. So if you are attending and there's bits you want to watch back, or you're interested in trying some of it out yourself and you want to do it live on Gatekeeper following along, you'll have a recording available later this week.
Yeah, that's a good point. James, I was just going to I like to put you on the spot, by the way, and I never tell you I'm going to do this, and I intentionally just didn't tell you just a moment ago. But this year there's been, some updates that have been put out. What are you kind of getting excited by? What's one thing that's kind of stood out to you so far, maybe over the last last quarter or so?
Of updates that have previously come out.
Yeah. I
Oh,
don't think we should talk about any upcoming ones just yet.
I don't know. You were putting me on the spot. I guess previous ones that have come out in terms of workflow cards. I know I just said a minute ago that I love workflows, and I really do. But in terms of workflow card usability, there have been iterations pretty much every month for the last 6 months now, just making things like workflow messaging, tagging, collaborating on processes like contract reviews, workflow forms, things like that. It's just been continuously getting better and better. And to be fair, last month did have a good update, but we do have another one coming up in maybe the next release after next one. That's going to be another improvement building on workflow messaging, like the tagging of it, options available there. But that would be my pick for what I'm excited about or have been excited about with Gatekeeper releases recently. Why, do you have
Yeah.
something that you are also liking, or is it?
No, I don't. I actually agree with you. As a former user of Gatekeeper, going back to over the last 4 years or so, I would
Mm,
say that one thing I wanted to see keep kind of getting pushed forwards was the ability to bring more people into conversations within Gatekeeper to get those conversations out of Slack or whatever instant messenger the organization uses, get away from
yeah,
emails and just kind of, as a, I was a contract management professional working with my procurement team. Like I didn't want any of us talking elsewhere. Like I want all those records inside of Gatekeeper. So for me, yeah, I absolutely agree. James, should we?
yeah,
I'd say let's make a start. Let's
yeah.
go on to the next slide. We're not. This isn't going to be a slideshow webinar, but we've just got these holding slides mainly to say that this is actually the last webinar in this Success Hours series that we've put on. So the whole goal of this series, from sort of when we started this at the maybe early last year, was to provide you with almost like a course of some kind, right? So you could watch every single one of these webinars uh, with zero knowledge of how to use Gatekeeper. And by the end of it, largely you're going to be in a really good place in terms of your knowledge around how to use Gatekeeper, your understanding of workflows, how to build all sorts of different parts and do all sorts of different config. We're actually going to touch on some of that today. One of the things that we're going to be revisiting today is custom data, pieces like that. So
Mhm.
this session today is all around third-party risk management, risk and compliance. And we actually did a session in November, James, I think it was, which was the Market IQ session where we had Richard on, our
Mhm.
account exec colleague, where we went, we kind of did safeguard compliance there as well. So this is just finalizing and finishing off that piece. So we
Mhm.
won't show, I don't think we're going to show any of Market IQ off. If anyone wants to see any of that, I would definitely suggest you go and watch the previous webinar we did. Any questions around that today, though, we're absolutely happy to go over there. But yeah, we'll have some different kinds of webinars going forwards this year. And if any of you have any suggestions, if you need any help from us, please let us know and we can kind of accommodate those in terms of our webinar planning throughout this year. But James, anything you wanted to say on this slide before we move on to the next slide? And I'll let you kind of take over there.
No, but you did raise something just a second ago that has made me think that I mentioned at the top of the call we'll be sharing a recording of this one. So if there's any features or content we've discussed that people want to watch back, they can. With the follow-up emails, what I do share is a form that you mentioned that you've alluded to there, where we allow you, if you have ideas for content or specific features you would want more in-depth explanations of the use cases and how to configure them, we'll send that form out with the recording as well, so that any input that you guys have on these educational webinar series, we'll take on board and factor that into what we plan for the rest of this year. So yeah, thanks for reminding me of that, Daniel.
Yeah, no worries. Awesome. Let's move on to that next and final slide that we have here. James, what's this about?
So, and I want to thank the people attending today, if you're one of the people that filled this out. So in the registration link for this webinar, we asked just a very simple question: how are you currently tracking and managing your supply chain risk and compliance? And we just wanted to get an input from a few of the attendees today, most of which will be Gatekeeper clients and Gatekeeper users, some of which might not though. We wanted to get a feel for how they're currently doing it. So what we have on screen is basically a breakdown. And it's worth noting that there were some answers that fell into many of these categories. So they're not necessarily single pick, we only use Gatekeeper, or we only do audits, or we only do manual checks. But it's just useful to get a sort of temperature check on the average, user of a system like Gatekeeper, like how are they managing risk and if they're tracking it at all, in fact. So this is just a few percentages on this pie chart, donut chart in front of us, to let you know where you might sit if you said that you track it in Gatekeeper, if you're not tracking it yet in your organization, and things like that.
Yeah, it's super interesting seeing, James, I know we've been talking a lot about this kind of stuff over the last week. I was just thinking back, like, prior to me joining Gatekeeper, I worked in sort of 8 different companies across a whole bunch of different industries, and this looks very representative of my time, which is like no approach yet, mainly because of like resource constraints or lack of tech, or just just not enough people with doing something else. Versus like having Gatekeeper in place and being able to do all of this in one place, versus the spreadsheet approach. So I kind of seen all of this, done all of this in the past. So yeah, we will kind of move on now, and we're going to show off a little bit around. Well, actually, we're just going to do a deep dive into the risk register. It's actually the risk module. It's an additional module that you can get from us over here at Gatekeeper, and we're kind of deep dive into that. But I think before we make a start, James, did you have a poll that we wanted to run first?
Yes, thanks for reminding me.
No worries. And then we will kind of give you a bit of an overview of this risk dashboard and some more pieces.
Yeah.
So James, this is a poll asking how anyone on this call, why they started tracking risks in the first place, right? That's what this one's about.
It was. We did actually change based on the answers that people gave in the sign up, with I think it was around 20% saying not tracking. We did amend the wording to say why will you start tracking risk, as a sort of optimistic view. But exactly, it's whether there was a particular event or just plan or goal that their organization had that made them take on that mindset of we need to start using software like we've got up on screen right now. And I'll just leave this dashboard up just as a bit of a teaser for what we're about to go through until we close that poll.
I can say with absolute certainty from my perspective over prior to my time at Gatekeeper, that regulatory requirements in the sectors that I was in was typically the driving factor as to why we had to do risk management.
Yeah,
so that's with one of your vendors is scary as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a nice to have, really. It's a need to have in order to like operate in the industry that you're in, right? Especially if you're in like finance or maybe healthcare and pharmaceuticals and things like that, where you do have very specific standards you need to adhere to.
And the regulatory requirements that we're seeing at the moment are only becoming more ominous. I would say that they're getting broader and more widespread. So awesome, James. Let's close this poll now, and then we can kind of go over the risk dashboard. So I'm going to hand this over to you to start with, and you can kind of explain a little bit, and then I'll jump in when needed here.
Cool. Yeah, so let me just share those results so everyone can see the results of the quiz, but they basically line up with what you were saying, that regulatory requirements is a really popular one on there, alongside some of the other to be expected ones like global events and severe incidents, things like that. But yeah, regulatory requirements far and above the most popular reason there.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense to me to see that. Excellent, cool, awesome. So James, maybe I'll just start off with the question of what on earth what are we looking at here?
Sure. So for those of you that have attended some of those previous success hours, I think it was one of our first ones where we looked at some of the gatekeeper dashboards. I think we started on the executive dashboard back when we were looking at contract and vendor data with more of a focus on like the contractual information you have in Gatekeeper. The risk dashboard is very much the same. So this is a living dashboard giving you analysis of the risks that you're storing in Gatekeeper. I want to use the word living because basically every data point you see on here is accurately representing the risks that we're capturing for our vendors here. And also all of them can be clicked and drilled into. So, and it even looks a little bit like the executive dashboard if we have some users on this call who regularly log in and see that one first. So what we see here is across the top, we have some counters around the risks. I mean, there's not many in this Gatekeeper environment, it's just a demo environment, but around the risks that we have open. And you can see some of these are giving us counters as an indication as to a bit of like just the number of risks and like the impact that they have on our vendor base, like insights around our supply chain, but also some of them can be seen from a standpoint of what do we need to do about some of these risks. So what we'll see in a few minutes when we jump into an actual individual risk record is there's a core element of these, which is called risk status. And there are 3 of those. There is open, which means that it's a risk that you're still assessing and planning how to deal with, planning contingencies and mitigation. There is accepted, which basically means you've completed your assessments and you're happy to deal with it. Maybe you've got plans in place. And there is a third status of closed, which basically means it's no longer a risk because maybe the vendor has improved something about how they operate, or maybe it's gone away because you contracted away from it, things like that. And the 2 statuses that appear in this dashboard are those first 2, open risks and accepted risks. And so you get those indications of which ones do we need to be doing something about. So we've got open across the top. There's 9 in this environment. One of those had a due date to complete an assessment here, and it's been passed. So this is letting me know that I have an overdue risk that I should have been doing something about by this point in time, but we'll come to that in a bit. And then we get some graphical views breaking down those risks, the risk that we have as well. So we get the most risk, the vendors with the top number of risks in our environment. So just with a breakdown of the risk impact levels and basically the risk score and then the actual vendor that it is. We also get those risks by status, another indicator of like what we've been doing or what we need to do here. So you can see most of our risks, just most of our risks are accepted, but we have quite a large chunk that are still open. So we have some work to do there. Risks by type, which may fluctuate depending on the type that you have in your environment, which again may be influenced by the industry you're in. If you're in finance or healthcare, or some other industry where some of these different risks will change based on what you need to be assessing for regulatory reasons. Which of your vendor types are most affected by these risks? And in this environment, only our tier 1 and tier 2 vendors are affected by risks, which to be fair might be typical. You might only actually want to put the effort into logging risks against your very critical vendors, whereas your low level transactional vendors, you might not necessarily need to put that much time into doing this level of assessment. But the very useful and insightful graph. And to be fair, if you are tracking risks in maybe in Excel or in another software tool or in Gatekeeper, this will be something that you're very familiar with, the heat map risk matrix, where what we have here is 2 core fields of a risk record, the probability of a risk becoming a real issue and the impact that will have, basically giving you a resultant score. So the placement on the top right being very, very bad, very highly likely, and a high impact, and then the bottom left being minimal, so very unlikely to happen, very low impact even if something goes wrong there. Yeah. But like I said, this is a very minimalist environment. We don't have many open risks, and in fact, looking at this risk heat map, we don't have too many that are to the right hand side of the board where things are necessarily bad. But if you were looking at this again from a less of a data analysis standpoint and more from a like a project management, what do we need to do standpoint. What you can do if you're concerned about these moderate impact, high probability risks, you can click this and it will take you through to your risk register that will show you those, in this case, these 2 open risks, and this one was a previously closed one. So I can immediately see what these risks are, and I can start to make, beginning my project planning to decide what are we going to do about these poor cybersecurity ratings on these vendors.
Yeah, James, it's a really good point that you make there, right? Like I was just saying to you before we went live with this webinar that this is actually my favorite dashboard in Gatekeeper, because the area that scares me and probably a lot of people in the school more than any other area is like what's going to happen within our like supply chain, what are our vendors, what's going to happen there with them. There's so many unknowns, and this is a really good way to start capturing some of those risks that maybe you identify as you onboard new vendors, as you go through the contract with them, and as you sort of move into that post-signature contract management phase, and you're just really trying to extract the most value out of your vendor contracts. It's a really good place to document everything. And like I've always used this area, you said it right at the start here, those open risks, those say 9, I wish I had just 9 open risks when I was using it. That would be incredible to see that such a low number. That's kind of where the team is going to focus its efforts on, and I would expect everyone to be checking in, very frequently on those. But just another really good one, I think you kind of pointed this out, was like the risks by risk type. Just getting that really good, quick snapshot. I used to get asked by like my CEO, my CFO, like, what risks are we dealing with? What issues have we got coming up with, within the supply chain, and who are those risks with? I could largely just go to this dashboard and get all that information in seconds, or just send them the link, right, the URL to this dashboard and say, hey, you can just go and check this whenever you want here. You almost don't need to ask me, but I'm more than happy to go through any of this with you. So yeah, really, really useful dashboard. And like the risk by vendor piece that you're just on there is kind of like a really nice to have like visual of like, which one of our vendors do we have the most risk with? And I'm always looking at that red portion, to be honest. And the darker the color, the more worried I am. So in this example, Cisco would be worrying me somewhat, but no, really, really, really useful dashboard for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of those that like we've got down here where most of our risks are with tier 1 vendors. It might just be the case that for your critical vendors, your tier 1s, you're putting the more work into assessing what are the risks that of having operations, so heavily tied to them. But yeah, it's a good point to raise that even though Atlassian on the left-hand side has the most, like the highest bar, like the most risks, Cisco is the one with the most, with the high risk score in terms of the combination of impact and probability. So it does give you that, the split bar gives you that indication as to what do you need to worry about versus what have you just been very thorough with capturing in your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And James, are we now going to go in and show someone how to actually make a risk event, like how to get this data into Gatekeeper?
Yeah, sure. And that was handy. Yeah, if I click Atlassian and we'll open up this vendor record, and you'll see, just like with contract records that have their own contract tab within the vendor, risk records have the same thing. So what you can do this directly from the risk repository, but if you're already making assessments on a vendor and you're uploading documentation and you're reviewing the other risks, you can do it from here as well. So within Atlassian, I can go add risk item, and I can give it a name, like data loss. And I'll say, when I'm adding this, I would, as we discussed earlier, this would indicate the stage that it's in terms of our assessments with it. So I'd add a risk with the status of open, and I'll give it that categorization that you mentioned so that you can be explaining what sort of thing you're dealing with. So I'll say this is a GDPR type risk. Probability, I'll say moderate, impact, significant, because this is a fairly big issue if things go wrong. And there's other things that you can put in here. So if it is the case that this is something that needs to be assessed by a procurement manager, someone that's in charge of dealing with this vendor and performing all necessary due diligence, I can give it to a particular user. And what I can also do is say that, Daniel, I'm assigning it to you, and you need to have either closed or made an appropriate acceptance of this risk by the 31st of March. So when you're logging into Gatekeeper in that overdue portion, if you're looking at your risks, you'll be able to easily see which ones have I missed, or like in my saved views in the repository, which again we'll show in a couple of minutes, which ones do I need to be aware of. So we've got a due date for that there. At the moment, just because I'm creating this is where you can put some comments maybe about the nature of why you arrived at the need to record this risk, or if any particular things have happened maybe with the vendor that makes you think that's useful context for anyone seeing this to be aware of in future. Like maybe Atlassian previously had lost data for us, hopefully not. You can put some comments and details around that here. But what we'll come to now is after the core details, I've actually got a custom metadata section that I've added that sort of builds on that element of project management that you can build into these risk records. And Daniel, you really wanted me to call that out because basically this harkens back to one of our, I think it was our second success hours, where we looked at setting up custom fields. So the only core elements you get with your with a risk record are the bits at the top. Those are the parts that plug into that risk dashboard which is reviewed. However, setting up custom data is very simple, but we'll show you what we've got here. And this is inspired by how we see some Gatekeeper clients using it, because the core data is good for capturing the base level information, but what you'll want to capture additional bits there to help other users understand what's going on with a particular risk. So what we have here as a first element is not just the risk status, but what's being done with it. So the mitigation, or you could consider this contingency plan status. And I'm going to say for this one that it is something that we want to do something with. It's not possible or not required, but because I've just opened it, I'll say this is in progress. And what we can also capture here, and we'll come to a save view in a bit where we talk about the deltas of like our actions changing the impact and probability of risk. We can capture the original, what would the risk be without us doing anything about it. So I'm going to mirror what we have up here. I'm going to say impact significant, probability moderate, and I can save this risk record now. And you can see if I go back to the risk tab of this vendor, there's our risk at the top, and this will also now be updating that live data we saw on the risk dashboard. But then what users can do, so this will probably be something that you do, Daniel, because you're the one that owns this risk record before March 31st, hopefully in this environment. What you would end up doing is when you have done something about this risk, let's say we accept it because there is something we can do, you can come to this environment, come to this record, and change that risk, that mitigation status. Let's assume you've got something that you can do about this particular data loss issue. You can say that we've got a mitigation plan in place, and you could say something like, I'm going to type quickly.
Don't worry about the typing. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine, James. But yeah, like you can give some sort of insight into what you're actually doing without someone having to necessarily read the entire mitigation plan that I think you're about to add into here, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in this environment, what we've configured is when someone says there is a mitigation plan in place, Gatekeeper will then allow them to populate the details of it. So like some comments around what it is, in this case, scheduled backups organized, and then a link to either a plan, which could be like a Google Doc or somewhere in SharePoint where you have some sort of organization plan, or even like you could directly attach it here. And then what we can do is to say, now that we've got that mitigation in place, the probability of this being an issue is minor, and the impact is even more reduced because we have scheduled backups. So we're not going to lose much data even if it takes place. And now when we hit save, did I change the status to accept? Yeah, I did. Now when we hit save, we'll know that this is an accepted risk. So it's no longer on that open risks tab. It's no longer be shown as overdue. And what we can also do, and I'll show you this later in a risk repository view, is do that comparison to say, of the risks that we have, which are minor, what have our actions been doing to them by comparing them with the previous risk values there. So this is just an example of how you can use custom data to build in a bit of sophistication, to not just capturing what the current risk is and some comments about it, but also like what's our backup plan, what's the contingency there, because that's one of those useful things that you want in a central source of truth like Gatekeeper, that anyone who wants to view this vendor in case of an event or something going wrong or risk planning for the future will be able to easily find that on this risk tab without having to message a specific risk department or message the procurement owner and say, have you considered XYZ? It's all easily visible, and you can find the planning and project work that's taken place there. Yeah,
James, that's super useful. I think the core data there, the bit above where your cursor was, just at this part here, yes, there's some really good data there. I just wanted to pull out that the property and impact score here is the one that commits to the risk dashboard, the piece that we
Heat map,
added
yeah.
below, yeah, to the heat map. The piece below in risk mitigation, where we've done impact without mitigation, doesn't get committed to the heat map, and that's why we've kind of done it this way around, right? So we've got the impact without mitigation below in the custom data, and we've got the residual risk impact and probability in the first part. James, just thinking, you said there was another way to go about adding risks, and I believe it's just on the left here, and I just wanted you to potentially just click on that real quick and just show that you can add a risk for any vendor in this section.
Yeah, so when you're, I mean, there are actually two ways to do it in this section as well. So I could, like with Atlassian, when I was on the vendor record, I can add and just start building the risk from scratch here. Or, and this is more the case that it's if you're migrating to Gatekeeper from an Excel spreadsheet, if that's how you've been currently managing it, what you can do is you can import it in bulk, just like contract records, just like supplier records. When you're on this area, you can download a CSV template that will give you all the columns that you need to populate in Gatekeeper, so that you can map from an existing risk, I assume spreadsheet for the most part, risk, environment where you're capturing risk, and you can bulk import risks, as you can see, like I imported 30 into this environment. So there's two ways to do it in here. One by one again, or in bulk if you're migrating a large swathe of them. But yeah, you can do it directly from the repository, or if you're in a vendor record, you can do it from there as well.
Yeah, and James, just one thing that was on my mind is when you were actually adding the risk, you went onto risk type, and there was a whole list of various different risks. Maybe if you could just show, like, as with pretty much any part of Gatekeeper, the huge positive for all of our customers is that the amount of config you can do. So you've added a whole bunch of stuff based on conversations you and I were having around like the types of risks that one may wish to monitor. And I think we're probably only scratching the surface based on what is happening all over the world right now with disruptions and risks. So yeah, could you just quickly maybe cover this?
Yeah, exactly. So just like many other areas of Gatekeeper, this is completely configurable. So when you have the risk module, it'll come with a few pre-built based on just typical examples. I think it comes with 3 or 4. But yeah, like you said, there's loads of different ones that might vary by industry or the country you're in or how large you are as an organization. So there's just a few that we're using here that we've configured based on some key examples or like very typical scenarios that we see being used. So you can see we've got BCP, GDPR, InfoSec, legal, loss of service, and there's even some other ones like ESG, which is we've talked about in other webinars last year. It's very easy to either edit these if they maybe are changing in name or changing in purpose, or just adding a new one, so that users in future, when they're adding risks or they're amending risks that they're storing, can start adding different categories to the risk types that you're logging in the system in Gatekeeper. Really easy to do.
Yeah, appreciate that, James. Is that I think that's everything we wanted to cover, right, on the risk module in a nutshell?
No,
am I mistaken?
Not necessarily.
Oh,
did you want to get the gun?
Sorry, yeah, I forgot about reporting and everything that you wanted to. So sorry, James. I am completely jumping past that. Please, because this is great to see. So please do it.
It's fine. You were so enamored with the risk dashboard. I think that was it. You were like, I've seen everything I need.
Yeah.
So alongside, I mean, we did navigate briefly here from the risk dashboard when we clicked through and we came to like a pre-filtered view. Like I think I clicked overdue and it showed us that one risk that had passed its due date. But basically the risk repository, just like the contracts and vendors repository, is a good Excel looking view of all the risks you need to be aware of, and it comes with some good filterable options though. So I've clicked through to just my standard view that's just like, here are all the risks that I can see, and actually there's 40. I thought there were 30, but there's 40 risks in this environment. But based on, a bit like in the risk dashboard, based on what I might be viewing this repository for, I can change up this view to see a few different things. So one thing I mentioned earlier was mitigation delta, like the difference between having a mitigation or contingency plan in place, what that's doing to the risks that we have. So this one is filtered by all risks where we've got a plan in place, and there's only 10 in this environment, some by you, some by me, where the current probability and impact is in a lot of these cases quite low, so the resultant score is also quite low. But this is showing that this is a result of having that plan in place beforehand. A lot of them, some of them were still quite low, minor and moderate, but a lot of them were a lot higher because without any sort of, without any checks or balances or anything like that in place, these could pose significant risks to the organization. And so that's why, and you called this out when we were in that custom data area earlier, that's why it's useful to capture this information for posterity. So you can say, this was a big risk. We have a plan in place now. It's now only minor probability. And actually this one still says it's significant in impact, but maybe the plan that we put in there wasn't great. But yeah, so there's different purposes you can have in here. So we've got like a retrospective review of the risks that we've done something about. Then you can also have this filtered to what are our critical risks. So high impact, high probability, and we want to filter those by like what's going on. So you can see not only in this view are we seeing that score, we're seeing, is there a mitigation plan? What's the date for when we need to do something about this plan? When does that fall? And you can see, I think this must be the one that was overdue, a service outage issue. But then this just is another one of those dashboards where it's not just a retrospective and analysis into the current vendors. It's like, this can be used as a project planning dashboard. You can come here and say, okay, we want to start clearing out, moving these through to either closed or accepted based on what we decide to do about this, or whether or not we decide it is actually a high risk, or if something needs to be planned for this. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly show that, Daniel, before we
absolutely. And I just one point to make clear here. This is making use of that saved view feature that's in the Gatekeeper repository, so you can build any kind of wild combination with all the data that you have in Gatekeeper. James has gone ahead and built these two, and I actually really like the Delta one, especially. Actually, I really like the Delta one just to show the merit of doing risk management. That's a really nice one. I think it often it's sometimes undervalued. So yeah, I think that's great. The critical risk one, like you said, really good as a project management kind of approach within the team. Like, which risks are do we care about the most at the moment? So yeah, I would absolutely recommend everyone make as much use as possible of saved views. If you're getting the data into Gatekeeper, like, absolutely go wild with saved views is my recommendation, because you can build so many cool reports for people in your organization, or to actually get on and do various tasks. Excellent. James, not to stop the flow here, but I believe that was everything on the risk register and risk module, right?
Yeah, sure. I do want to launch a poll before we close out this section.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
If that's okay. So I'll just get that up on screen for everyone.
Okay. And what is this poll, James?
It's not just asking, a bit like the poll that we asked at the sign up, like how are people doing it. It's asking who's specifically in an organization, if there is a a stakeholder or team that's responsible for it, who's the one that responsibility normally falls on at the organization that our attendees are working at right now. Like, is it is it like the legal team that do it in the matter of getting contracts set up and drafted out, or is it dedicated procurement professionals, things like that?
Yeah, good poll for sure, because for everyone here, it's probably going to differ depending on the size of their organization. For some of the smaller organizations, they probably aren't going to have too many dedicated resources for risk management. Excellent. Right. James, whilst this is whilst you leave this up maybe for another 20-30 seconds or so, what are we going to cover next? So it's all about workflows now, right? And particular compliance workflow that I don't think we've shown off at all. I know we've spoken about it a few times, but we're going to do a quick deep dive into it because it is a smaller best practice workflow of ours, right?
Yeah, correct. It's basically the scenario of where, and this does tie on, like, follow on from the risk element. So like, and I'll use this risk record as an example for that. It's basically the scenario of where you have, maybe for regulatory reasons, that might be a very common one, or just, general risk management, you have particular documentation you need to be collecting for your vendors so that you can pass your own audits to evidence that you're doing your appropriate due diligence. It's not just making sure that that's captured and just in your system. It's making sure that that documentation stays in date. It stays, valid. So what we're going to show is a workflow that automates exactly that. So the example I think I'll show is like an ISO certificate, but it could be applied to insurance documents, accreditations. It could be applied to like audit documents, like SOC audits that your vendors might be performing, but it's for those sorts of documents there. And yeah, the reason I had this risk record up is this is a risk that I've marked in this demo environment as, let's say this is an accepted risk, to say there's no penetration testing for this vendor. However, we have a mitigation plan in place that we are at least happy that they have the appropriate ISO accreditations and SOC compliance and things like that. And the plan for this is that this vendor will have compliance documentation, ISO certificates and SOC audits that are regularly updated in the system automatically. So yeah, we'll demo that to show basically how easy you can make it, because that could be, and you can probably talk to this more than I can, Daniel, but that could be a massive time drain if you need to be doing that for a lot of different vendors in Gatekeeper. So
Yeah.
hopefully there's a lot you can take away from the workflow we see.
Yeah, James, perfect. Close the poll. That's what I was just going to ask, Pat. Excellent. Oh, that's a very big mix, kind of wise. Yeah, that seems super interesting. Awesome. Yeah, and James, just maybe 2 points to add to this workflow and the concept that we're about to go over. Like, we're always needing to get documents updated by our vendors. Like, stuff expires every single year. Like, really, like, you can use this workflow that we're about to show for just about any kind of document that you need. Yeah. Because there's so many weird and wonderful pieces of documentation that various people in your organization will want to get their hands on, and this is just like a really easy way to do this. Like, James, we were talking, you just alluded to like the time save element, and I used to be part of and run a fairly smallish team in a fintech, and prior to Gatekeeper, the team was spending sometimes an ungodly amount of time chasing mainly ISO and SOC certificates, because these were contractual requirements with our customers. Regulators were kind of eyeballing us, and it was really hard because there was I can tell you now that a main portion of our weekly team meeting was effectively a RAG status review of just chasing documents. And like, we were all sat there like, this is ridiculous. This is such a huge amount of work, and we get it's obviously vital and critical, but like, there's so many other activities. We're sourcing new vendors, we're trying to renegotiate contract renewals, we're actually trying to get the performance of various SLAs, especially from a lot of our SaaS vendors, to be as good as possible. A lot of our consultancy spend, like, we're trying to stay on top of all of that. But then, like, the team's just having to spend so much time just like emailing hundreds of different vendors across the world every single week to be like, hey, your SOC certificate that we've got on record is like out of date now. Like, you really need to get this to us, or can we get like a bridging letter? And it was just it was super painful. And once we this was one of the first workflows that we deployed after vendor onboarded, and it just got rid of that need to do that. There, of course, there's still a little bit of chasing at times, but you'll show like you can build in the escalations and things like that, the reminders, and it really automates all of that. So I don't want to take your glory here, but like, from a real world example of someone who's implemented this workflow and seen it just absolutely get rid of a ton of admin. And actually, we didn't need to hire an admin procurement. We're going to bring in an analyst to kind of help us do a lot of this admin. We didn't need to in the end because of the reporting and stuff like that. So really, really beneficial. I'll hand it over to you because I'll talk for days otherwise on that.
I do want to, before I jump in, I do want to ask that question. So you mentioned, I think you mentioned briefly around a bridge letter there. Was it the case then that if you didn't sometimes have your documentation up to date in time, you would need to, for regulatory reasons, collect a letter to say this was, we didn't capture it before the expiry date, but it was valid, and we had the ISO certificate. It just wasn't provided in time, things like that.
It was really only for when certain vendors of ours really were so ridiculously, painfully slow with just about any piece of let's call this what it is admin, right? But it's super important admin, because typically I would have put contracts in place that say like you have to maintain throughout the term ISO 27001 accreditation SOC 2. So we really needed to just from a contract management angle, like we're on top of this. So it's fairly serious stuff there.
Yeah.
But sometimes we just needed to get some assurance that they were actually doing this. And really, that letter was an admission that they're a bit slow right now, but it's in check. And that would, if we had an auditor coming in, we kind of want to pass those sort of bridging letters, just to be, hey, we are on top of this. Our vendor's just a little bit slow, just to make sure we pass our audits as well. So that's really what it was to that.
Okay. But yeah, then I'll jump in and we'll talk about some of that, because I have seen organizations a bit like the one that you were at with similar sort of really hard lines that they had to draw with their vendors. But we'll talk about how hopefully those don't have to be crossed because it's so simple to set up. So we have for this vendor, Atlassian, again, an ISO certificate that we have for them, the 2023 version. And you can see that this one has an expiry date that's been logged against it that says it expires on March 1st, which is very soon. So the way that we've configured this workflow, and I'll go over to our workflows board to show you, before I actually jump in, this workflow starts with a trigger. And for those of you that have configured Gatekeeper workflows, you'll know that this green lightning bolt means that it's a triggered workflow, so it starts itself. And the trigger that we have for this is file expiry date is approaching. So for any vendor that is pipeline or live, you don't want archived vendors pulling onto this, where the file expiry date is 7 days away. And you could change this to be 14, or you could change it to be 1 if you only want the expiry date to be what starts the workflow. But for any of those files that meet that expiration date, pull them onto the workflow and notify the vendor to let them know we need a new one uploading directly to Gatekeeper. And once the process starts, it's a really simple one. So all that happens is the vendor is asked to replace their file. And like you said, we've got, like you said, Daniel, we've got built into this both escalations to if they don't provide it in time, as well as automatic reminders just to keep prodding them to say, we still need this, you have agreed to give us this. So basically, there's 2 phases that are useful for this. One is where the vendor provides it. This is a contingency for if they miss that deadline. But then just where an internal user over here will check the file before they then commit it to Gatekeeper, and then the process is done. So it's a really simple one. And what this will look like, I've got my emails up over here, and I have a user who's called, I think he's called Victor Vendor, who's received an email. He's received a few actually, because he's received reminders letting him know there's a file expiring in this Gatekeeper environment. Vincent Vendor is his name. Lets him know the name of the file. This format smushed up my email a little bit. Gives him a deadline for the expiration date for when it expires, and also a deadline for when he needs to provide that in Gatekeeper. And it also gives him a link. So if I copy this, and I'm going to log in a different browser over here and open it up, well, this will take me directly to the card, but I'll just take you to my vendor portal. So this will take Vincent Vendor to his vendor portal, and as you saw, it directly opened up the card. But if he logged in outside of that notification, he would have seen that he had a file expiry form to do something with. He can go update, and you can see this is the current version, the 2023 version. So I'm going to upload a 2024 version, and I'm going to set the expiration date. I'm going to move that on by a year, because I'm assuming that Vincent Vendor knows when the next version is valid until, and then all he has to do is hit submit. So it's that simple. Gatekeeper, using that expiration date, will start a process, notify Vincent Vendor in this case. It will chase him every few days if needs be, and only escalate internally if he's being really slow, like those vendors Daniel mentioned, where they're not adhering to the deadlines that are harshly being set, or crucially being set. But once he does submit it, which is the ideal use case, back in Gatekeeper, this is where the internal stakeholders will finally be let know that Vincent Vendor has provided this. And this could be an individual, like the procurement manager that deals with Atlassian, or the particular vendor that provides it, or it could be a team, just to anyone from that team. You can come and review this, and all they have to do, check what Vincent has provided, confirm that they want to save this, update this file that's stored in your repository, and they'll be able to see here that both the file and the expiry date have been modified. Just in case Vincent forgot to update this, you'll be able to see whether or not he did. But they can confirm here the file, that the expiry date and the file's been updated. I'm going to update that and commit it back to the database. That's done. And what you'll then see is, if I go to Atlassian as a vendor from here, open up the Files tab, here's the ISO certificate. The expiration date is now 2025. It's no longer in red saying 2024. And what I can do as well is I can view the history, and I can see there were previous versions of that, but version 3 that was uploaded by Vincent Vendor via this workflow here with a bit of audit level information is the most recent version there. And I can, if I want, go back and download the historical versions of that. So I can see 2022, 2023, 2024 versions there. And that's how simple it is. The only notification that you, or the only task that you as an internal Gatekeeper user need to do is receive notification that Vincent submitted his document, commit it back to the Gatekeeper database by just hitting that blue button. So hopefully really easy to do. But there are things that, yeah, it's built into this that if Vincent didn't do his task here within, I think it was 2 weeks we built in, it would escalate internally for like a vendor manager or a risk manager to do something about that, like,
or the contract owner, right? Like potentially, like, that's how I would almost think about it, James. Like whoever is that, you know, owns that relationship with that particular vendor, like sometimes they have just an easy way in or a different contact that they can push. James, I just wanted to just 2 points from me here. That internal review phase is so critical when you're doing this, because you can almost without like a digital workflow in place, and if you just have this via email exchange, it can be quite a like passive exercise to get these documents. So even when you receive them, it's really hard to satisfy an auditor that you've actually taken the time to like review that document. Yeah, like it's so hard to do. I prior to using Gatekeeper, I had a very basic CLM in place, and it had no way to do that. And we had a particularly onerous SOC 2 audit, and they just kept focusing on the fact that whilst we have the documents, we had most of the documents, thankfully, despite mainly because of the hounding of those vendors that we had to do, it was so hard for us to actually evidence that the team had taken the time to go and review what was in those, especially like a SOC 2 report can be, they can be big, they're scary, and there's a whole bunch in those, and you really need to evidence that you've taken time to review it, and just building in like you've got here like a comments piece or something like that, or an approval button that you can add here could do a lot of can do a really good job of showing those auditors that, yeah, we've received this from the vendor, we reviewed it, someone else in the team, maybe we create a different phase. This is one of our best practice workflows, so you can just customize this to do whatever you want, right? So you could have this internal review phase, and maybe for ISO documents, it goes off to your InfoSec or IT team or something like that, right? And you have a dedicated phase built for that. Those kinds of things really show to your auditors that you're doing everything that needs to be done, and also internally it just gives a lot of assurance. And then the second point, James, you were in the vendor portal just now on your other when you access the email as though you were the vendor, right? And what I would say is, like, especially for the vendors that you're building really good relationships with, the ones that you're using a lot, what I'd really do is, if you have vendor portal, really encourage your vendors to check into this very frequently and use it to help get more out of them. So you can do all of your communication in here, you can do all of your obligation management with them, and more importantly, they can come in and update the various pieces. It's very likely that for some of your vendors, you may have dozens of open forms, which are requests effectively to come and update or do something. So I think just making use of a vendor portal, and I imagine that many of you on this call have heard about like portals, supplier portals, vendor portals, other kind of names that are used for it, but they're a really great way for your organization to collect vendor data without you ultimately doing anywhere near as much work as if you were doing it via sort of email or spreadsheets and things like that. So yeah, they were the 2 points I just wanted to add there, James. James, was there anything else you wanted to add to this part?
I mean, I got this view up because you were talking about evidencing that someone has been in charge internally of checking it over and committing it back to the database, which sort of, if we look at those 3 pillars of the success hours, falls into that take control element, making sure that you can evidence that it's not just data that's being added to your repository without any sort of oversight, someone is doing it. And in the history tab of a workflow card, if an auditor was interested in, did someone definitely look at this, and did someone definitely check it over and commit it, or was it just a vendor just uploading something to a data room, you can show, well, yeah, James Ince did, and he moved this card over to review completed because he's the one that saved it back to the database. So you can evidence who did it. I probably should have been more thorough in the little demo where I captured it.
No, it's fine.
But
that wasn't a dig,
right.
James. Don't worry. that was not a dig. But if I think it's a really good point. The history tab that you get on a particular workflow card, and then via the lifecycle view on the repository view. Like, these are really good ways, in seconds you can show this to an auditor and they'll be, quite happy. They would probably still like to see in a comment, right? Like to that point. But like they can see that someone has taken that accountability over, yep, we are committing this to the record. And there's a phase that literally says internal review. So it's really hard for them not to effectively not to pass you on that. So all good. Perfect. Excellent, James. James, is that everything? I think you've got a final poll that you wanted to run, but is there anything else you wanted to go over? We are here, we've got 10 more minutes. If there are any questions, we'll absolutely take them. So please, if ask questions via the chat or Q&A, we'll absolutely get to those in a moment for you. If there's none, we'll obviously finish a little bit earlier than 5:30 or whatever time it is in your location. But yeah, James, do you want to run the poll and go over any last points your end?
Yeah, let me close poll 3 and launch this next one. So yeah, we'll launch that final poll. Nothing. I mean, there was one thing that stood out when you mentioned around, if you had written into your contract with vendors that they need to be providing this documentation by X date before expiration and stuff like that. I have seen a few Gatekeeper clients using this workflow, taking a really hard line like that, where, I mean, let me open up the email that I had here. So this is the email that went to the vendor that's like, please help us ensure that we don't go too long with them. And it's quite passive. It's just a gentle nudge to say there are deadlines and you need to provide this. Some Gatekeeper clients take the opposite approach, where they say, if you don't meet this by X date, you're not meeting your contractual terms with us, and we might have built in penalties to our contracts and things like that. So you can tweak that best practice workflow to fit how harsh you want to be with your vendors. But the best practice template just generally comes with the actual deadlines that are built in functionality wise. But some of our clients are a bit harsher than others, and change this up a little bit based on what they expect. Yeah.
No, James, it's just coming back to that theme, right, that we've kind of mentioned throughout. Like, you can configure pretty much any part of Gatekeeper yourself, and the messages are a really great way here to kind of signal your displeasure at times in a very professional way. So yeah, absolutely make use of it. James, just quickly for everyone here, the poll that we just popped up is just to help us get you the right support. So if any of you need any specific help with anything that you have seen today, please let us know. We'll share this with your customer success manager, and we'll get them to reach out to you pretty much, as fast as possible within the next sort of 48 hours, so that they can help you hopefully start your sort of TPRM journey with Gatekeeper, and start doing some of this really cool stuff. When you combine this with what we already covered, and I know not everyone on this call would have seen it, but the market IQ piece as well, when you put these, all of this together, you end up having like a really good compliance capability that relates to your vendors. So yeah, let us know for sure. But James, there's no questions coming in. I think we are good to close the poll. And I just want to say thanks to everyone, especially if you've come throughout the entire year with us here and been to a whole bunch of these success hours. You can find all of the success hours over on our knowledge base. If you've only just joined and this is your first one, I think there's something like 10 others that you can go and check out. And we'll send out a copy of this within the next week or so. But yeah, thanks everyone for your time and attention. James, thanks so much for a really good breakdown. I think you're just going to go and show everyone where they can find everything. So I won't close it off just yet. I'll pass it over to you now.
No, that's fine. So yeah, if you are interested in catching up on that back catalogue of particular features in the help center of any Gatekeeper screen, you can go to the knowledge base, and then down in webinars, you'll see here we have our success hours. We've got the restore visibility, take control, and we'll be adding this one as the new safeguard compliance to round off those 3 pillars that we want to educate you on. But yeah, thanks very much for attending, everyone. It's been great getting to go through some of these features.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.